Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Are your students ready for their next step? Developing the essential skills for college and career readiness. As I said, I'm Doris Zahner. I'm the Chief Academic Officer at the Council for Aid to Education, and I'm going to be the host and moderator today. And we very much appreciate everyone that's joining us. So today's webinar is brought to us by EdWeb and CAE. CAE, our organization, is a mission-driven nonprofit group dedicated to improving student outcomes. So you may be familiar with some of our assessments on critical thinking and problem solving and written communication, CLA, Collegiate Learning Assessment, CCRA, which is the College and Career Readiness Assessment, or SSA Plus, which is the Success Skills Assessment. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our panelists. We have Leanne Lenti and Matt Montano. And Leanne and Matt, would you take a moment to just introduce yourselves to the group?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Doris. And thank you everyone that joined us today. I'm really excited to get to have this conversation about college and career readiness and how we currently are thinking about that and acting on that in the K-12 space and education. I currently work for the University of Virginia Partnership for Leaders in Education program. We support school transformation with districts and schools around the country, and I'm really excited to see we have a lot of states represented that we're currently working in. We spend about a year working with school districts, helping them think about conditions and systems and service to low performing schools. And then we spend an additional 2 years supporting school teams directly. So these types of topics are often front of mind for the schools we support. Prior to joining PLE, I was with the College Board for a few years. And then prior to that, I was in New Mexico at the State Department of Education, where our College and Career Ready Bureau was part of the work that I oversaw. So really excited to be part of this conversation today. And thanks for making the time to spend with us.
Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Montano. I am the superintendent of Bernalillo Public Schools here in North Central New Mexico. I oversee a pre-K through 12 program. I started August 1st of 2021, so I'm still relatively new in my current role. But one of the things that we're looking to design is a pre-K through 12 college and career readiness program. I think as probably the conversation will go today, I think college and career readiness and the skills necessary for that don't just start in the ninth grade. They actually have to be cultivated all the way from when students start in school. So that is my current role. Prior to this, I was the deputy commissioner for the Texas Education Agency, overseeing special populations, specifically students with disabilities, English learners, and highly mobile and at-risk populations. And some of the conversation that we're going to have today is going to be really critical to how we serve those particular students. And then prior to that, I actually was at the State Department of Education, where I met Leanne Lenti. We were colleagues for a good period of time in our work. At that level, I oversaw a teacher evaluation system for the state of New Mexico. That was a really pleasant experience, and I gained a lot of friends because of that work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leanne and Matt. I'd like to actually get to know the audience a little bit more, and we have a few questions for you before we actually get to our discussion. So please answer, what is your role within the education system? So the options are teacher or instructor, administrator, guidance counselor, or other. And if you are other, we're asking that you put your type into chat. So we have a coach, team chair, special education. So it looks like a nice mix in here.
Mm-hmm.
So about 37% it looks like are teachers and instructors. The largest two groups are teachers and other, and we do have some administrators and guidance counselors as well. So thank you. And then we have some questions. Next, we have some questions for you on how valuable you think these critical thinking and problem solving skills that we're going to be talking about for students, careers, and this is for academic success. So how important do you think these are for students in their academic tenure? From a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not valuable at all and 5 is extremely valuable. So far, it looks like the overwhelming majority that we have data on are saying that it's extremely valuable. Wow, this is great. Okay, and what about our next question in terms of career success? So the first one was about academic success. How important do you think that these skills are for success in career, where one is not valuable at all and five is extremely valuable? So we're seeing similar as the data come in
Mhm.
um, as the academic success, although there is a larger proportion of participants who are saying the four as opposed to five from the first question. And then the last question is, how valuable do your students think critical thinking and problem solving skills are for their own academic? Like the first two questions were how important do you think they are for the students, but the students themselves, how aware are they? How do they feel about their own career? This is interesting.
Mhm.
As the data are coming in, it seems like students may not be as aware of the importance of these skills for themselves. The teachers and educators, we think they're important, but the students may not know. This is really interesting. Cool. Okay, so this is great because we have a baseline for our discussion for today. So I just want to give a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about in terms of critical thinking and problem solving, as well as communication. When we talk about critical thinking at CAE, critical thinking is such a huge domain. We're looking very specifically at three pieces within critical thinking and problem solving. One is data literacy. The second is critical reading and evaluation. And the third is critiquing and argument. And these are pieces in which parts of critical thinking that students need in order to be what we think successful in college and career. And then on the written communication side, there's writing effectiveness. So, how well can students craft a response to whatever topic that they're trying to, communicate? And then whether they can do that with proper grammar, punctuation, vocabulary, etc. So that's just a little baseline in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about critical thinking, since it's such a big topic. So the data that we have at CAE, as I mentioned, that we're a nonprofit organization, and everything that we do with respect to our assessments are based on research and best practice. So this is data that I analyzed, and basically it's for entering and exiting university students. So students who are entering higher education, and then as they exit and graduate. And what we found was, of the 70,000 or so students that were part of this sample, 60% of them were not proficient in critical thinking or written communication skills when they entered university. And the range of universities is everything from the top tier down to community college, where there isn't an entrance exam requirement. By the time the students graduate, and this is from the sample of about 52,000 students, 44% of them are still not proficient in these skills. And even though the students do gain proficiency in these skills, there's still a lot of room for improvement for the top group. So you'll notice at the very top, these are our advanced students. There are only 3% of the students graduating university reaching that level. So we do see that there is a lot of area of improvement for this. And our research that we've done, which is a longitudinal study about validity, shows that students who do better on our assessment of critical thinking actually have better outcomes post college. So that is employment, full time employment, salary, or enrollment in graduate school. So those who do better do have better outcomes in these things that is measured after they've graduated. So we followed these students for a year after they graduated. And then, not just within CAE, but just more globally, we know that employers are emphasizing the importance of these skills. So 95% of entering undergraduate higher education students at a leading business school within the United States believe that these skills are valuable. So we had about 550 students participate in a critical thinking module in the class, and they were surveyed to see how important they thought this would be to help them advance their career. And then research shows that the hiring managers out there, through surveys, et cetera, are always ranking critical thinking, analytic reasoning, problem solving, communication as the top skills that students need in order to be successful in the workplace. And yet these skills are not reported on a college transcript or a high school transcript if you're going from high school to career. So we think it's really important to start the dialogue of why these are skills that are needed to be taught, and that's where Leanne and Matt come in. So I've got a couple of questions for you. How important do you think these skills are for college and career?
So I'm happy to jump in and get our conversation started on this question. And thank you, Doris, for sharing that data. Even though I had seen it before, seeing it again, it always sort of gives me pause when I think about how we are or aren't getting students ready for their next steps after high school graduation. One of the things that I think back to actually from my time in New Mexico is we had a statewide work group that was put together by a couple of state agencies where on a pretty regular basis, we were talking to employers from around the state, getting a sense for where they had gaps when they were hiring, the skills they were looking for, and what we, from the standpoint of the education department, could better do to prepare our students. And at the time, and I don't think this was unique to New Mexico, I think this is pretty consistent around the country, there was a significant gap between skills employers were looking for when they were hiring students, particularly those coming straight out of high school, and the skills our students were graduating with. We absolutely were putting an emphasis on content knowledge. And I think just assuming that those critical thinking skills, those problem solving skills were just sort of coming by default or being provided to those students via another mechanism and weren't intentional about how we were setting up our high school teachers and counselors and leaders to really consider that when they're thinking about instructional practices for students. I would actually love Matt to jump in. One thing he didn't mention when he introduced himself is that he was a high school teacher and principal before he joined the state team. So he worked in a comprehensive high school where they were having to think about balancing content skills as well as critical thinking and problem solving skills. And I think his perspective on this would be really valuable.
Yeah, thank you, Leanne. I think one of the, what jumped out at me immediately as Leanne was talking about the work that was done here in New Mexico between employers and agencies is my experience in the classroom or even as a principal, where I would talk to teachers who are struggling with certain students, and they would talk about how students were struggling even though they're so bright, right? And I say that because it was kind of like this nebulous measurement, and the students were not doing well because they were not doing well in compliance, but they demonstrated some other skill sets, and it was never actually clearly stated. And in my mind, those were some of those critical thinking skills and some of the things that were potentially evident that teachers would recognize how these students are bright. Now, coming to the state agency and then kind of overseeing policy and seeing how districts were going through all of the things that they were trying to do to launch academic achievement and what have you. I saw that there was like this just big gap between how schools function to serve the needs of building those critical thinking skills. Right? It's really a compliance exercise. Successful students are more compliant than they are actually doing these things that we would say are important. I often used to tell my youngest daughter, I said, you're everything that's wrong with school, but you're like everything that's right for being a woman in America to be able to break through some of those glass ceilings. So keep doing what you're doing because you have all of those skill sets that don't necessarily get taught or honored in the schools. So my thought process is it's extraordinarily important. I really felt, and I still feel to some degree, we create a compliance exercise where students can get a paper document that doesn't accurately reflect whether they're ready for the next stage in life, whether it's college and career. And so I was looking at the data and seeing the reflections of everybody on this webinar reflect that. I was kind of surprised. I thought that the career readiness would have reflected significantly higher proportions of, or like 98% would say you need these essential skills for career readiness, but it kind of flipped a little bit differently, and so I was a little bit surprised by that.
Yeah, I was too to see that. Thank you both. Leanne?
Oh, I was just going to say one of the things I was thinking about. So we work with a number of high schools around the country, and they are thinking about are they really preparing students well for their next steps? And for so long, that has really been a focus and an exercise in reading and math and the state assessment. And they know that they need to think about other areas and other ways to prepare their students, but they either feel like they don't have the time to proactively build that into the curriculum during the day, or some teachers may not have the skills they think they need to really weave in some of those essential skills, like what you lifted up, Doris, around data literacy or critical reading and evaluation. They might not feel like, as educators, they are equipped to do that effectively within the content they're teaching. So it also makes me think about how we are preparing teachers to make this authentic and meaningful for students. I don't think it has to be you take math in one period and then in another class you get the opportunity to think about those readiness skills. I think there is a way, and I know great teachers do it on a daily basis, where that is just in the DNA of how they make instruction come alive for their students in a really authentic manner.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions. So the way that this webinar is structured, this is, the basic essential skills, but we're going to be talking about the current state. So really, what are practitioners doing currently, and then what the future state should be. So how do we move from where we are to improving these skills? So a few other polling questions. Given what we just heard, how is instruction of these essential skills currently given in your classroom or your institution? So choices are as a separate module within a class, as a separate class itself, completely integrated within a class, it is not specifically provided, or other, which you can type into the chat. Split between not being specifically provided mostly and completely integrated within a course. And a few people are saying that there's a separate class. Would be very interested to hear about your course when we have Q&A later on. Other. So some are saying that it's a workshop and there's an after school program. Okay. Next question for the group. How are you assessing? So you might have these programs, but how would you be able to measure these skills for the students? A third-party assessment, a third-party survey, internally developed assessments, internally developed survey, or other. So let's look. It looks like there is the winner here is internally developed assessment of skills. Interesting. Or other. And then the last poll is, how do you use this information? What's the primary purpose for using the results? Are we doing this as a district level policy decision making, for your institution itself, for quality assurance, for curriculum, feedback for students and faculty, or other? Most are using this for faculty and student feedback. Great. It's great to see that this practice is being used. Oh, here's an interesting one for senior graduate presentation. Cool. Thank you. So, given the results of this, for Leanne and Matt, let's discuss the current state. So, how should districts and schools measure these skills?
I would say in the current state, and I'll be speaking very specifically about the district that I have. I have one comprehensive high school. I have no evidence that there is an intentional measurement of any of these skills. And just ironically, this morning, I was looking for a headset because I needed to get a headset that I knew I had here somewhere, and I found a document that's a legacy of Leanne's work in New Mexico, that is a focused monitoring of a high school visit on school transformation. And there was a significant amount of feedback on some of these questions that was very clearly not evident when this visit was done, like I think in 2017 and 18. And I still don't see that evidence. So I would say the current state here in my school district is that there is no real profile of what it would look like right now. And so that's still a development component of it. I would say that as I was looking at some of the chat, I think that what I've recognized as I've been around different states and looking at how high schools are designed, I see more evidence of a lack of intentionality about measurement around this area. I don't see that, like I see that you might walk into a classroom where the teacher has a very clear insight as to what they're looking for and they're measuring it, but that's not necessarily the comprehensive way that the school's doing it. It's only where you have really good systems in place that I'm seeing that happen across the board. And
Mm.
even now, as I've been talking to superintendents here in New Mexico, the idea actually seems almost unthought of by most of our superintendents here in New Mexico. So I think that we have a lot of work here to do on this area of measurement. But there's plenty of tools out there. It's just, the not just the intentionality about using those tools to make sure that we're assessing and then understanding what we're going to do about what those assessment results present to us.
Mhm. Thanks. Any thoughts, Leanne?
Yeah, so in the last few weeks, there's been a decent amount of national press on high school graduation rates, particularly the graduation rate for the class of 2021, and that it's experienced a slight decrease compared to the cohorts before that. And there's a lot of conjecture and dialogue about the impact of COVID. And what it made me think about is when we're thinking about high school graduates and who gets to graduate, so much of that is still based on meeting content expectations, taking a certain number of credit bearing courses, meeting certain thresholds on an end of course exam in some instances, a portfolio of work, sort of depending state to state. And I know a lot of states have updated their high school graduation requirements in recent years and tried to make them more flexible in terms of how students can authentically show what they've learned, but it's still very focused on core content subject areas. And so I think there is a real opportunity, especially as changes are likely coming in the next few years in terms of assessment requirements and how we think about school performance overall, to really think through what matters in terms of truly preparing our students for their next steps, whether that be entering the workforce or entering a post-secondary institution, and then how we make that as authentic as possible in terms of measurement. And, as I said before, great teachers are weaving in how they're giving students the opportunities to practice and hone some of those problem solving and data literacy skills that Doris, you shared a little bit about at the outset. But I think there is an opportunity for bold schools and districts to be really intentional in saying, this is something we're going to prioritize for our students, and this is how we're going to make it meaningful and actionable for them, and also set our teachers up for success. And I actually think not only will we have students better prepared to enter the workforce with the skills they need or post-secondary institution, I actually think that will allow them to also do better from a content standpoint. If you look at some of the research and data on how those skills are coupled, I think there is great opportunity as we look a few years into the future for what's possible for our students.
Mm. Great. Any
Doris,
thoughts about? Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Matt.
yeah, real quickly. I actually one of the things I was thinking about is, with the recent surge that we had with Omicron, I'm a relatively small district, so I got the opportunity to substitute teach in a few classes over about a 3-week period, and that gave
Fun.
me really direct opportunities to work with students and ask them questions. So, the beauty of that opportunity was I was able to ask them questions about something that would be similar. So if you're in a New Mexico history class in seventh grade, at the end of the day, the expectation is New Mexico history is a content standard that we want them to know something about or what have you. But a bunch of 13-year-olds and how much they carry on that content into the rest of their life is probably limited just because of they're 13 years old and so forth. One of the questions I asked them is, has anybody explained to you what you will be able to do better by learning this content? Like, what kind of skills are you going to be able to take forward by learning this content? Is it reading? You talk about critical reading and evaluation. So if you're thinking about New Mexico history and some of the primary sources that might be used, have they been able to take that over? None of them knew what they would be able to do better because they've learned that class.
Hmm.
And I asked middle school students, I asked high school students the same questions as I was substituting, and they were all kind of in the same boat. And so I think like the current state is, at least in my district, that we have got a lot of work. I'm just going to tell you, we've got a lot of work to do. The current state is that we have a lot more thinking to do about how we present the meaning behind the work, right? So it's not just knowing dates and facts, or maybe sometimes innuendo in the facts, but also knowing how to access it, how to better interpret it, and how to better define or defend an argument when you're reading something, right? And that's actually something that nobody could clearly delineate at the middle or the high school level. And I thought that was really meaningful because it really kind of taps right into what Leanne was talking about
Mm.
and what you're asking with this question.
Yeah. Any thoughts how since you're looking at these, like when should students be measured and how the data can be used or should be used to help improve?
I mean, I said this early on. I don't think that we should start thinking about these skills at the high school or even at the middle school. I think we should be thinking about these skills and developmentally appropriate the type of skills as we're getting kids
Mhm.
into the early elementary, right? One thing that's pretty interesting is you can go ask kids what they're learning in a kindergarten class, and if the teacher's really, really good, those kids can actually articulate what they're learning and potentially why they're learning it, right? That should be something that they're doing.
Mhm.
It's not going to be rocket science. It potentially is actually just phonics, right? But they could tell you why, and that would be an avenue for you to introduce those types of skills without them even knowing that they're utilizing them. And a good teacher would be able to assess that,
Mm.
in an informative way, ongoing.
Right.
So, in terms of what and frequency, and thinking more about our middle and high schools in particular, I think the more frequently we can have insight into students' development of these skills and their ability to really be able to say clearly and with confidence why these things matter for them as an individual, whether it's because they want to pursue a career after high school or pursue post secondary education, the sooner we can equip them to first do that self discovery and really have a sense of self so they can find their place in school and really feel like they see a path for themselves, I think is something that is often discounted and we don't do as intentionally as we can. And in terms of frequency for how we assess that and give feedback to teachers, I know I've said authentic multiple times, but I mean that sincerely. I think the frequency matters, and I'm not going to say it has to be 3 times a year or 4 times a year. I think we could
Mhm.
spend multiple webinars getting into the debate around how often we should be assessing these skills in students. And but I think as ensuring that they're getting feedback for why we're assessing these skills and where they are already doing a fantastic job and excelling so we can build their confidence and they can use the skills they're really good at to help them improve areas where maybe there's room for improvement. The piece that I keep thinking about is, especially when we're thinking about high school teachers and middle school teachers, is how we are equipping them to be able to support these students in this area. We spend so much time giving them great PD on content or great PD on tier 1 instructional practices. So what should these teachers be looking for when they're trying to informally, if we're talking about an informal assessment of how students are doing with data literacy skills or critical reading and evaluation, in addition to having a more formal metric available for decision makers at the building and district level as they're thinking about this across a whole system. I think there's room to consider a both and approach, both an informal and a formal approach to this work.
I like that. So just your thoughts on the importance of these skills going into the future. So what do you think the role is for future and whether it's going to be more or less important?
So I imagine, and if I had to predict, I think they're only going to grow in importance. I think about our experience the last few years as educators, as we had to make a really fast pivot from how we provided teaching opportunities and learning opportunities to students to all of a sudden everything got moved to being delivered in a virtual manner. And as educators, we had to tap into a lot of critical thinking and analytic tools to be able to do that effectively. And we probably did that without really giving it a ton of thought because we were just in the moment making it happen day in, day out. And so as I think about future workforce in this country and how I think a lot of what we assumed was going to be the way we needed to recruit and hire talent, I think we've learned a lot, and there's going to be more opportunity for innovation in terms of how we're hiring for people and the type of jobs we're hiring for. And so I think our students' abilities to really own these skills and be really confident with how they are able to engage effectively with employers if they are having to learn in a remote or hybrid setting. That requires a different skill set for them than sitting in a classroom with a teacher like they have historically done. So I think it's only going to matter more. I think back to when I was in high school and my English and writing teacher and the amount of sort of work we did on writing mechanics, thinking about that competency that you shared at the outset, and then compare that with a conversation I had with a colleague right when everything shut down in March of 2020. She is an educator. She's a former district administrator in a large urban district on the East Coast. She works for our organization. And she had a high school student at the time. And she, for the first time, got insight into what his instruction looked like because he was learning from home. And she was astonished that there was no emphasis on writing mechanics for her junior in high school. And she had this moment of, oh my gosh, is my kid going to be ready for college? Because his essays are terrible. And I didn't know until now. And I'm an educator who's worked in this system my whole career. So I think we've learned a lot in the last few years in terms of where there are gaps. I think we've also learned a lot in what could be coming in the future. And those two things only emphasize how much these skills are going to matter, not just in the short term for kids, but in the long term as well.
Yeah, we do some work with the OECD at the higher education level, but one of the projects coming out of the education director of the OECD talks about skills, and there's a skills gap, and then also the fact that the students who are preparing now for the future, we don't know what the jobs in the future are going to look like. There are jobs and careers that exist now that didn't exist 20 years ago. So we want to be able to prepare students with these transferable skills like critical thinking and communication in order to prepare them for the future. Matt, were you going to add something?
Well, I was actually thinking, even though I'm not hiring students right out of high school, I've developed a process over the last 4 years where I have applicants after they go through a screening process, like a phone screening process, just to kind of check some basic questions. They have to do performance routines and inbox activities that they have to do on the spot and demonstrate some of these skills as within a time limit, just to demonstrate that they have those skill sets.
Mm-hmm.
And I often find that a lot of individuals, and these are degreed individuals, are struggling with some of these skill sets. So we think about it going back to the K-12 setting, and this is a transformational time period. I also, I think, like I listened to like what sometimes you listen to Elon Musk and what he's looking to hire, and he's actually looking for what you've actually demonstrated right here, these kinds of critical skills that they want. And that's what a lot of people are looking to hire right out of the gate. So I think from a hiring process, I see very critically what I want people to have. I'll just use an example. I'm a relatively small district, and so I'm accessible to directly to students. So when I have the student body president of the high school send me an email requesting something, and even though the request is compelling, the way it's written wasn't well done. The mechanics were weak, and the effectiveness overall was weak. Like I addressed it, but I was less um, excited to address it. Whereas the senior class president did the same thing, and but it was so well written and articulated, and like I was like, I'm going to engage this one right away, and I should be engaging them equally. I get it. Like I should, they're both students of mine. I should be engaging them, but I just thought about like the difference in the writing and how much different I felt with one student's writing versus the other student's writing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was like that, those are like real life experiences that I say, okay, how do we make this, instead of make this the anomaly, make this how kids are coming out of our school.
Agree. Just a couple more questions regarding future state before we get to audience questions, because I see that they are coming in, and I want to be able to spend some time. What are some of the barriers or challenges to accomplishing the goals that we've discussed today? And how do you think that we can, remedy them?
So I don't know if this is a barrier or a perceived barrier, but I think we would hear that there's not enough time in the school day to explicitly address
Mm,
learning opportunities for students with these skills. And again, that might be a perceived barrier only. It is true, the school day, especially for secondary students, they have a lot happening day to day. There's a lot that happens within a high school building on a daily basis to keep things running well and on time. So I do imagine time could be a barrier. I think there are creative ways we can help schools address that barrier and create time. So obviously, one of those things is that these skills don't completely get decoupled from content courses, that these
mhm.
skills get integrated when that student is in an algebra class or a biology class or a social studies course. But I do think time could be a barrier. I also think uh, how we prepare teachers from a PD standpoint could be a barrier. There is already so much on teachers' plates right now, probably more so than ever, just with everything they're having to balance, with COVID still very much an ongoing and real thing. And as an organization, we're really lucky. We usually get to work with schools whose teachers have additional time at the beginning of the school year to come together to prepare for the year. They usually have additional planning periods during the week to really prepare for instructional delivery for their students, but that is often not the norm. And so, how we are intentionally setting teachers up for success. I also think helping students understand why this matters could be a barrier.
Mm.
I have never taught high school, but I have spent a fair amount of time with high schoolers. And if it is not something they see as valuable to them, they are often the first to dismiss it. So making this real and believable, I think, could be an opportunity for improvement as we think about barriers.
And I
Matt,
think to
thoughts?
Yeah, I think to some of Leanne's points about time limitations, I also think some of the technology tools that we have open
Mm,
ourselves up to solving those. So one of the things I
Mm,
would like to do is, with the fact that we have Google Chromebooks and Google Meets and Zoom meetings and things like that, or we have the Google Classroom or whatever anybody's using, whatever platform they're using, I don't necessarily think we're at what I want to see for the use of those platforms, but we create opportunities. So even though we have a 5 day week where you have a 7.5 hour day or so for your teachers, it gives us more opportunity for two things: starting early to build student agency on their own learning, because that's always been a criticism. Teachers do all the
mm,
work, but students don't actually own any of it. one of the things that we can do with some of these tools that we have is start building student agency, and managing students to take advantage of that, of their own learning. And in doing that, we've been doing, because universally our district is really invested in the science of teaching reading, and so all of our K-5 teachers are doing letters training. The days that they do letters training, students are doing asynchronous learning, so they all have to go into the Google Chromebooks and in the Google Classroom and get that, and get their instruction for the day, right? It's usually going to be built off of lessons they've learned before. I don't necessarily think that we're great at it. I just think that it's a tool that we can use for purposes of giving our staff more opportunity for professional development. So as Leanne said, you can't create more hours in the day, but you can use those hours a little bit more wisely. So if there's opportunity for us to actually continue instruction or continue learning activities, but also open up time for our teachers to get more professional development, and I often think about like the Japanese models very specifically, about how they very intentionally split the day for those teachers to get professional development. If we can start doing more of that, then we can start teaching teachers how to do this and give them those kind of repetitions, so they can create the muscle memory to be doing this intentionally.
I
Great.
think just one more item, Doris, sorry,
Sure.
another place we can help, especially decision makers at the system level, so whether that be school leadership team, district, or state, think about is they don't need to be the innovators for how these skills are assessed. So you can then make decisions for what gaps you need to close. There are great resources and tools already in this space. I think oftentimes in education, we are innovative by design, and we feel the need to build our own assessment tool or our own series of forms, any number of things. So I also think we can strategically think about what already exists in this space and tap into proven resources, so that we're not having to spend the time sort of building the plane. We can spend time flying the plane and making it run as efficiently as possible.
Agree. Thank you. So thank you to both of you. Let's take some audience questions because they've been coming in. I've been getting little messages. Let's see. There are some questions regarding the college and career readiness assessments. I don't want to take the time to talk specifically about the instrument. I can tell you, if you do have questions about this, you can go to our website and request more information. So I'm happy to speak with anybody about ways in which we can measure these critical thinking, problem solving skills. Um, there is a question that looks like, let's see. Here's one. Is there a way in which do you, the panelists, foresee high school graduations requirements changing from content-based assessments into more um, competency and college career mastery of these skills? So moving away from ELA and math and more into these other skills in terms of graduation requirements.
So we'll see if Matt and I's thoughts on this are the same. I do not think we will ever fully move away from ELA and math skills being assessed across K-12 in the United States. I do think there will be an opportunity, and I do think it's coming sooner rather than later, to expand how we think about what makes an effective school and how we determine if students are prepared for things like high school graduation and what they have to do to meet those requirements. So I think there will be opportunity for the schools and the school systems to think about how we are determining which schools are considered effective, and starting to think about how those schools are preparing students for their next steps beyond English and math. Matt might disagree. So I don't think we'll make a full move away, but I do think there will be space to consider other skills that we know matter for setting students up for success in the long run.
No, I'm actually in 100% agreement. I
Mhm.
think that I do think like I don't think you throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like I just feel like there's important information that we get from the existing assessments and what they tell us. That there's first of all just information about what we can do to better our instruction when it comes to the content. Content is still important, and there's also predictive information about what that means for our students. I do think there's a growing interest here in New Mexico. Definitely, there's a growing interest in diversifying the assessment suite. The concern that I have is we always we always tend to lean to what's easiest to measure, and so that could make us less
Mhm.
innovative in diversifying our assessment suite. And I'm not just talking about from a perspective of measuring effectiveness of schools or even from an accountability standpoint, but from giving us kind of real time information so that way we can actually make informed decisions for our students. You know, in my experience, we have always been a very data rich education system. I think the United States has been very data rich for the last 25 years because we've been doing many, many things to drive assessments. In New Mexico, specifically, because we haven't actually had meaningful assessment for some time now, we're actually data poor. And now
Mm.
people are craving data to be able to make informed decisions, which is really unique to me because that wasn't Leanne. You can say that wasn't always the way it was here, and maybe people know that there's no data, so we want it now. But I think from a standpoint of a good balance of those things, because I don't actually think that I think again it's a both and, right? Like we should be using all of the tools that we can, and I actually think assessment is a learning tool as well. It's not just an assessment tool, but it's a learning tool for students and a learning tool for teachers as well. So it's not wasted time if you think about it that way.
Thanks, and I completely agree. I think ELA and math and social studies and science, these content areas are going to be there. But is there a way in which we could, it's content plus, and the plus piece is really what we're talking about, right? Um, Question for you both regarding outside of the classroom. So there were several of them in the question box. What can parents and others who aren't in the classroom with the students do to help improve these skills?
Well, I mean, I think we're actually my district. We're really trying to kick off school family and community engagements. I think that schools traditionally are not set up to really invite families to be part of the instructional process, right? So again, I'll use the term compliance exercise. So parents that are highly involved tend to understand what their kids are doing, and the kids that are most compliant are doing relatively well. But do we really describe what kids can do when they're being successful or when they're not being as successful, right? Do we describe what they're not able to do? And so, like in our kindergarten, or I mean, in our elementary schools, we do standards based grading, which means we can actually tell families what the students are actually able to accomplish. So, an ABC doesn't actually mean as much to them, but a
Mm,
standard that they can actually accomplish. Well, if we were to transition that up to the middle and high school, competency based grading, right, where we can actually message to families, okay, if your student is doing this well, this is what they can actually do. What and then how can you support that? But I think there's one actual critical aspect of it. In New Mexico, it's been about 10 years, I think, maybe a little bit less. Legislative Finance Committee, an interim committee for the state, did a study on seniors in high school. And essentially, we overspend on our seniors in high school. I don't think that that's unique to New Mexico. I bet you it's in every single state because most of those kids are doing things like work study, athletics, things like that. They're not really in school all the time. And then they're just taking like basic courses to check boxes. And I think about outside of the school, not just parents, but community, how could they be pivotal in providing access to our students to be able to practice these skill sets, right? Because that's actually
mhm.
where the students are going to be most able to practice the skill sets. And it doesn't have to necessarily start in high school. It can start in experiential learning at the elementary and the middle schools as well.
Yeah, I heard the term competency-based education, and I think there was a little discussion in the chat about that too. Seeing the importance. Leanne, any thoughts about this?
So I
Support
love that.
outside the classroom?
Yeah, I love the dialogue and conversation and the recognition that this isn't just the school's responsibility, that
Mhm.
the broader community has a role in really getting clear on what we need and desire for our students in terms of their preparedness for entering the workforce and hopefully entering an economy that is innovative and growing. And so as your communities are making decisions about it can start with what students have to know and be able to do to graduate. Make sure you are bringing your voice to those conversations. Otherwise, it's going to be people like Matt and I who are going to have the louder voices in those conversations. And while the perspective of educators matters, if you are a business owner, if you are actively hiring out of your community college or your local post-secondary institution, like help those institutions understand what you actually need in the workforce when you're hiring. And when those skills are not being met, tell them as clear and tangible as you can get. I think it helps decision makers make better decisions about what gaps they want to fill within a school day, whether it's at the K-12 or post-secondary level. And I think I am not a parent, so I don't really have a great perspective on what parents can be doing, but I do have nephews that I spend a lot of time with, and we spend a lot of time talking about, especially with the little ones. There's a set of twins in the first grade, what they want to be when they grow up, and equipping them early to really think about what they're excited by. One of my nephews loves to build with blocks and magnet tiles, and he loves to look at his mother's coffee table book of architecture. And so we're saying, like, do you know what an architect is? And he didn't. He's 7. He does now. And he thinks that sounds really interesting and cool. And so just getting really creative, even as someone who has a role with kids in your life, equipping them with really being able to name what they like doing and why they like doing it is going to make them a better advocate for themselves in school so they can get the skills they need to be successful.
Great points. And I also want to just say that these skills that we're talking about, critical thinking, problem solving, communication, these aren't skills that you could just learn in a single class, in a single grade.
Yeah.
They're lifelong skills that build upon each other, right? And so even seeing an increase in the skills, to see a huge increase within a month, right? One semester of coursework is most likely not going to happen. These are lifelong skills that you have to start young. As we heard, one of the themes today, we shouldn't be starting at high school. We should be looking at, younger kids and building upon them, measuring, assessing, improving, and hopefully by the time they enter college or career, they will be competent in these skills. So thank you both so much. Again, thank you. And if anyone is interested, as I mentioned, in learning more about the assessments themselves, you can feel free to contact us through our website, and we'd be really happy to show a demo or give you more information. And again, thank you so much, Leanne and Matt, for your time today. And we hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much, Doris.
Thank you, Doris,
Have a
and
great
thank you,
day.
everybody. All right, bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us.